And then we'll have it available for tune-up, because my guess, Margaret, as I turn the floor over to you, is my guess is this isn't something that a new board like us gets the first time around completely, let alone remembers it forever.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Maybe.
And I agree. I mean, there's
little.
a lot of content and information here. And I think we're really smart to be having this conversation now before we actually finish our work and come forward with the recommendation, because it really is important for all of you to feel like you have a full understanding of the choices that the Housing Authority has in front of it, and has the information to make the best choice for you, for Needham, the town of Needham, for the Needham Housing Authority. And it really relies upon, I mean, I can present all of the information, all of the choices, but and a recommendation, but the ultimate decision rests with the five of you. And the more comfortable, the more informed, and the more confident you are that you have a full understanding of the choices and the advantages and disadvantages of some of those choices, is just going to then position you to feel comfortable and confident in making the best decision for the agency and for the Housing Authority residents. And I do agree with Reg that it's reiterative. We're going to be talking about this a fair amount. We'll be revisiting some of the same concepts again, but having the ability to actually go back and grab at what we talked about today and some of the questions and back and answers to back and forth that we have. But even we'll send the PowerPoint over as well, that can be revisited. But having the opportunity to come back to the video is, again, something I think well, you'll tell me if it is helpful.
Yeah. I would also just add, since this is our really formal board kickoff here, that I found in Marion, when we did the Little Neck Village project, that the board is also going to be asked by others in town, as to, specific questions about this, that, and the other thing. And so this is also, in that context, whichever, whether it's, Penny and Ed doing their EJN thing, or going before the planning board, or just bumping into people in the supermarket, or Janice seeing people at Seabeds and Cook, people are going to ask you questions about what's worrying them. So I think that's another important context for us here.
Right, should I
go for it?
Go.
You should be able to share your own screen if you want to here.
Yeah.
Do you want us to interrupt you as we go along, or do you want to get through a first overview?
I think probably the best is going to be the interruption piece. Just because I think there's, one, I don't want to lose somebody's questions. And two, I think it will help if we're contextually in the subject matter that we are. And then if we find it's slowing us down, then we can kind of revisit that. But I think that might be helpful. And I was when Reg asked for homework, and I went to the RAD resource desk, or the recapitalization or the repositioning site at HUD, and the handbook is really, I think, very thorough. And I have to say that the RAD office and the it's actually the Office of Recapitalization, has a local Boston person who's director of that office at HUD. His name is Tom Davis, and they have actually put out some of the best work out of HUD that I've seen in my 30-year career working with HUD. And having handled and overseen a number of the Cambridge Housing Authority's RAD conversions. The staff that he has working for him are actually some of the most talented HUD staff that I've ever worked with. And, you know, typically I've had an experience where HUD looks to be an obstacle to any progress or effort to move something forward. And it's the absolute total opposite in the recapitalization office. That they're really there to kind of help housing authorities, you know, work through the choices they have and work to make the best choice for a local housing authority. And I think you'll see there's a lot of choices available, and it's not one, you know, one shoe doesn't fit all, or and you know, there's a lot of what are the priorities of an agency, of a community, that really factor into them what's the best option available. So we're talking about public housing conversion or repositioning to Section 8. So we'll hit into that. Our table of our content for today is why would you even consider doing it? What are the various avenues available to do it? How do you go about determining, you know, what makes sense? And we call that conversion test. And then kind of end up with a few final thoughts, a review a little bit about the resident process, and then what our next steps will be going forward. So why consider conversion? I mean, to me, this chart kind of tells the story. Something we've been watching really since 2008 in Cambridge, where you've seen the blue line is what's been happening to the public housing operating subsidy funding every year. The red line is what's been happening to the capital fund subsidy. The green line is the Section 8 voucher program. So the public housing side of the house at HUD has pretty much been level funded forever, you know, for the last 12, 14 years, and even before then. And then occasionally, like in 2012 and 13, you've had a cut, and it hasn't been much better on the capital fund side, where, you know, again, we've seen dips, but we're pretty much still at the same level of funding as we were in 2008. And one of the things that hasn't stayed the same has been the cost to run a housing authority. Construction prices have gone up. Utility costs have gone up. We know health insurance has gone up. The cost to administer and run public housing has not stayed the same, but the resources that HUD expects a housing authority to operate public housing has stayed the same. So even though it's level funded, because the costs are going up, it's like you're getting cut after cut after cut. You have to cut back something to actually be able to just keep the lights on or the doors open. But on the Section 8 side, it's gone up over 47% over that same period. And so there's usually been historically much more of a constituency to support funding for and increases for the voucher program. And we've had more of a silent constituency that's supporting public housing. And when cuts need to be made, they usually make it down on our side of the equation than up here, and we'll see that in a moment. So what happens if you're level funded or your experience is cuts? It makes it very difficult to plan. You know, there's a lot of budget uncertainties. I know every year when Cambridge is planning its budgets, you know, it's trying to read into a crystal ball of what the proration is going to be on the operating side of the budget. And, you know, we'll plan for, I think one year they planned at 84% of what the true need was, because you could be certain, and I think it ended up at 89, so it was better, but there's always an uncertainty and always a surprise. You know, the lack of funding means that there could be operational maintenance or management staffing cuts, because you just don't have the resources you need to fully staff out the work that needs to happen. Oftentimes funds are not available to do extraordinary maintenance. You might need to resale the asphalt or do a roof, but there's just not money. So you'll say, oh, I'll do it next year. And next year becomes the year after, the year after, the year Routine maintenance becomes difficult to achieve. for some housing authorities, and I'll say Cambridge included, we had to have had some units offline because of poor condition and the lack of adequate funds to make the renovation to restore those units to habitable condition. Inability, to complete the needed improvements to buildings and units over time. Cambridge did an assessment about a decade ago of its entire portfolio, larger portfolio, but the need was, it was going to take us 32 years to get through the needs of our property with the funding level that we had in place at that time. And that didn't account for any new needs that would just accrue on a year-to-year basis. And the story is very similar at every other housing authority that I've participated with it or assisted. And then if additional costs, whatever you don't do now is going to cost more in the future. So these are all of kind of the underlying factors that, make you say, well, you can stay with the cards you're dealt with right now, which is kind of a bad set of cards for running a day-to-day operation, or you can look to try to reshuffle the deck and try to improve your position, the agency's position, and the access to funding. And that really is the key piece to why you would even start to think about it. And you see here the benefits that, you're moving from the HUD public housing side of the house at HUD to the Section 8 side, which has historically been better funded and has had greater public support. We expect, and you'll see even in today's presentation, that we think it will generate some meaningful new annual revenue for Needham Housing Authority, so that you'll see a bump up in the increase of your of the funds that you get to operate your housing. And then you can also increase and leverage additional outside funds. And if you go forward, one of the things with RAD right now in particular is that we do have slightly higher capital funds than we'd had, even 5 years ago. And if you go the RAD route, it allows you to lock in those higher capital funds forever, because the rent would be based on today's higher numbers than tomorrow's lower numbers. It creates a greater budget certainty. Even if the Section 8 program were cut, because you would be at a higher funding level than you would be at public housing, the cut would not be as impactful as it was if it was public housing. And then one of the advantages of repositioning is that you actually create meaningful operating and capital reserves. You have money in the bank that helps weather any kind of cuts or any unexpected occurrences. Conversion would allow Needham Housing Authority to fund needed improvements immediately rather than to keep them over time. And in our world, we feel like, as I said earlier, you do it sooner, it's less costly than if you do it later. And then it provides for, I think, more flexibility and local control, particularly if you're not in the public housing program anymore, you don't have to go as often to the public housing side of HUD to ask for this, that, and everything else. I mean, you still have obviously some regulatory requirements and responsibilities, but the oversight is very different when you're on the Section 8 side of the house. And so you've heard conversions, you've heard repositioning, and I just, I wanted to say what they're kind of interchangeable. And it means, your housing authority is moving one or more public housing units out of the public housing program. Tenants as part of repositioning will receive replacement housing, which may be in the form of a project-based or a tenant-based assistance. It really is, in my mind, it's like changing funding platforms, but not changing mission or not changing who you're serving. And for many housing authorities, I talk about repositioning and conversion as a means of strengthening a housing authority and the resources it has to meet its property needs and its resident needs.
Can I just ask a question about that?
Please.
So when you say it's, so tenants will receive replacement housing, which may be project-based or tenant-based assistance. So if we reposition, does that mean that if you take a unit and say move it out of public housing into section 8, then does that mean it would be a project-based section 8? Or how?
It depends on which option you select. And that's one of the things that we'll talk about. There are some options where it is absolutely a project-based voucher. And I'll explain in a moment what the difference is between project-based and tenant-based. And you guys may already know that, but it's really key because a project-based voucher is attached to the unit. And if the resident moves out, the voucher does not. So you can then move in another low-income family and benefit from having the subsidy continue on that unit. But if it's a tenant-based assistance and the tenant moves out, they take the voucher with them. And then you don't have a source of, potentially you don't have a source to provide an operating subsidy in that vacated unit. And there are different conversion options that result in different different choices of whether it has, it can be project-based vouchers or tenant-based vouchers. And that's going to be an important consideration to the Needham Housing Authority, I think, moving forward. Because I expect, you're looking for a long-term plan that's going to provide a long-term subsidy to support the portfolio you have, and having residents take their subsidy with them isn't necessarily achieving that.
Can I follow up with a question just to make sure I understand it right? Which is, at first I found it a bit confusing saying we're moving out of public housing into section 8, but now I've come to understand it, and I want to just check if this is correct. We're moving from one public housing funding stream, aka section 9, that goes back to World War II-ish and doesn't really do the trick anymore, to another public housing funding stream, aka section 8, which provides much more flexibility and more generous subsidies to work with. Is that, and by the way, you're sort of half cut off in your screen there.
Thank you.
You might want to just swing it down a little bit here.
Try again. Let's see if that does
it. Am I understanding? So we're still public housing after this as well, but just in using another part of the federal public housing program.
You will still be a public housing agency. That's not going to change.
No.
And I would say that the funding will change. You'll be still funded under HUD, but HUD has a number of different programs. It has the Office of Public Housing, which, as you said, Reg, funds section 9, which is the public housing program. And then they have multifamily housing, which funds the section 8 program. And so I think about it as switching buckets of funding. You're still under the HUD umbrella, but instead of getting your funding through section 9 public housing, you're now getting it through the multifamily housing program, which funds section 8. So you're changing your funding stream, but you're not changing your mission, and you're not changing your who you're serving.
And then if I could add one more understanding, I've come to understand, to confirm, the other thing that happens, and I'm sure you're going to be getting into it, is that the rules and regulations under section 8 and the way the funding stream is committed to more robustly opens up other sources of private funding that otherwise isn't available under our current section 9 public housing, like being able to take on a mortgage and use the money there to renovate apartments. Is that right?
Right. So under the public housing program, you can't use operating funding to support any kind of debt. And oftentimes you can't use capital funding, though they've made some adjustments to that, but nothing that actually allows for any kind of meaningful debt on the property. So, sometimes a housing authority has done some capital fund financing to fund certain equipment through to an equipment purchasing finance vehicle, but you really can't put a mortgage on the property itself when it's public housing. But when it becomes Section 8 housing, then that ability to actually take on conventional debt, and you still have to be able to pay for that debt. And as Reg suggested, the added boost in income for Section 8 would be the resource that you would have available to do that, but it would allow for you to bring in funds that would not be available to the public housing program.
Thanks.
I have a question.
Oh, please.
So does that mean whether it's tenant-based or project-based, that all the units will be Section 8?
Yes, it depends, again, depending upon the path that you choose. And we'll cover that in a little bit more detail as we move forward.
Thank you.
So here, just an introduction to the different forms of subsidy. What does the tenant-based housing choice voucher assistance means? And it just means that the rental assistance follows the tenant and it is not tied to a specific unit. And that's very similar to that. I mean, it is the same as what your existing housing choice mobile program is, where you're allocating a rental assistant voucher to a specific individual. They go out and choose a unit in the private rental market where the landlord is willing to accept the voucher, and and provided the unit meets certain requirements, the housing quality standards, HQS, rent reasonableness, the resident can, or the tenant can use that voucher in that location. But then, they could move the following year to another location, or, I certainly had the flip side of it, that they're at the mercy of the private landlord who might decide to rent to somebody else the following year, meaning that they would have to move even though they weren't interested. The other form is called the project-based voucher, and that means the voucher is actually attached to the specific unit in a building. And then the voucher stays in the unit even after the tenant moves out. And one of the things that as you do more project-based vouchers, you come to realize that is if a tenant lives in a project-based voucher unit, they do have the right to request a tenant-based rental assistance voucher after the first year of living in a project-based voucher unit, but they may need to wait until a tenant-based voucher becomes available. So that's been an issue in Cambridge, where we have probably at this point almost 4,000 project-based vouchers in Cambridge. It means that a lot of our available tenant-based vouchers, not all of them, but a lot of them, go to people who, for whatever reason, are interested in getting a mobile voucher, even though they've lived in a subsidized project-based voucher unit. So, it can have an impact on the operations of your day-to-day mobile housing choice voucher to have a significant number of project-based vouchers in a community. And then I just made a note that the project-based voucher is the most similar to the public housing operating subsidy, because the public housing operating subsidy is also attached to the unit or to the development, and it doesn't disappear, it doesn't move if the tenant moves out. It's just available for the next tenant as that they move in. And that is going to be an important consideration, because if you have a choice to do a project-based voucher and lock the subsidy into the unit, then it allows you to continue to occupy that unit with an income eligible family, going forward for the future. If you have a tenant-based mobile voucher and the resident moves on you, what do you have? You don't have then an operating subsidy left for that unit. So how, who are you renting it to? Who can you rent to and cover your ongoing expenses? And so that's going to be an important consideration as we look at the various different conversions options to which ones require them to be tenant-based vouchers and which ones allow them to be project-based vouchers. And then it will be important for us to get, to understand where you guys line on that, and, and how important that is to you. In my mind, the project-based voucher and locking it to the unit is an important consideration, and one that I see that's critical to ensuring the long-term affordability of the property and the long-term ability of the housing authority to continue to manage the property and serve the same population. Before we dive into the different options, I also wanted to do an introduction to Faircloth, because that will come up in a variety of different things. And has anybody heard of Faircloth before?
No.
So Faircloth Authority is a limitation that Congress put in probably now, I think it was 1996. So about 25 years ago, that basically specifies the number of public housing units that a local housing authority can own, assist, or operate. That each housing authority had gotten a certain number of units approved by HUD that they could own and operate. And for a lot of housing authorities, that number is exactly matches what you have available. So in Needham's case, your Faircloth Authority is 136 federal public housing units. And lo and behold, what you have is 136 public housing units. If you wanted to create a new unit, you couldn't, because you don't have 137 or 38 or 39. You are locked down to the amount of public housing units you have based on this limitation that was, created in 1996 as an amendment to a certain funding bill. And so that's what you can do. But one of the things you're going to see as we talk about the conversion option is each of the conversion options handles what happens to your Faircloth Authority slightly different. So when you go through the RAD process, or you do a streamline Section 18 or 22 process, a couple of the different options, those types of programs, you actually give back your Faircloth Authority. So say you want to convert the 46 units at Seabeds to RAD, because that's the thing that makes sense, then the housing authority's Faircloth number would change from 136. You would subtract the 46 units at Seabeds. Your new Faircloth number would be 90, and that would match what you have at High Rock Homes and at Captain Robert Cook. But there are some programs where you can convert to Section 8, and one of them is the Section 18 obsolescence approach, where you don't lose your Faircloth. You convert the unit, so your your Seabeds units, 46 goes to the Section 8 program, and that's where you're getting funding. But it leaves the ability for a Needham Housing Authority to potentially create 46 new federal public housing units in Needham. It provides access to that federal public housing subsidy dollars. And one of the things that HUD has done in the Office of Recapitalization, again, kudos to them, is that they've come up with a way for housing authorities to actually move forward and create new public housing units. So I'll give you my Cambridge example. We've done Section 18 conversions for over 1,000 units. And the Cambridge Housing Authority now has the ability to create 1,000 new federal public housing units. Again, you have some of the same problems with the federal housing program where it's not enough subsidy per se, but it becomes a platform of a subsidy that can be helpful. And you see we're working with the Medford Housing Authority right now to recycle some of their Faircloth authority to actually convert their last state public housing development to a federal public housing program, which will eventually become RAD for them, but it becomes the tool to actually potentially revitalize or reconstruct their last state public housing development. That's, not that dissimilar to Chambers, where it's a 2-story elderly building where people have to walk up flights of stairs to get to the second floor units. I think they may be in a little worse condition than Chambers physically. And so the strategy there is actually to tear down the buildings and do a new mid-rise building with elevators. But the key to the funding for the Medford Housing Authority is that access to Faircloth authority. So I just wanted to introduce Faircloth because you'll hear it come up, and it can be a tool that, if you can save it, may have some value to the Needham Housing Authority. And then just,
Can
kind
I
of.
ask a question there?
Yep.
So I see that we have 30 units at Cook and 46 units at Seabeds and 60 units at High Rock, and that adds up to 136.
Right.
And then, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we used to have 20 additional units at High Rock that were turned into 20 duplexes. Does that mean that back then we had 156 units of Faircloth and we lost 20 in that, or how?
No, because at the time, it's
Yeah.
an excellent question, Reg. But at the time that High Rock was converted, it was actually state public housing.
Mhm.
So it did not become federal public housing until probably 2011 or 2012.
Okay.
There was a little it became a known thing, but there was a little provision in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act
Mhm.
that Obama passed after the Great Recession
Yeah.
that suspended the Faircloth for any project that was funded through ARA.
Mhm.
And basically that got interpreted so that if you spent $2,000 to renovate a state public housing development, you could convert it to federal public housing.
Mhm.
So Needham Housing Authority converted the remaining 60 units to the federal public housing program under that umbrella. And so did, any number. I mean, Cambridge did about 500 units. Malden did a bunch. But I remember at the time, I think Pam Allen was the executive director, and not many suburban housing authorities did the conversion from state to federal, but you guys under her tenure did, and I thought it was a brilliant move, because
So-
it basically makes High Rock eligible for any of these things that we're going to talk about, where if they hadn't done that, they would not be eligible.
And so again, and I know you don't want to get in the weeds of it too much, but would it be then fair to say that because of this exception in the ARA Act, that when we would have had 76 Faircloth units, which is Seabeds and Cook, and we were able to add 60 more,
Yep.
the remaining High Rocks, that's how we got to 136 today.
That's how the math works, exactly.
Okay. Wow. Okay, keep going.
Yep. So just a couple more
But
slides.
I had one more.
Yep.
Was it a political thing? This Faircloth amendment, was it demand?
It was a political thing. They wanted to pretty much put a stake.
Prevent more public housing in the
Yep.
country.
Yep.
Wow. This
And
North
so
Carolina dime.
Yeah, and it's striking to me that that now it's really being advertised to as a means to actually create additional affordable housing units, and they've set up a whole process where you can create new federal public housing units and then immediately convert them to RAD as part of the same transaction. Which, Cambridge right now has not only are we working with the Medford Housing Authority with their fair cloth units, but we're moving forward with reusing about 150 of our own fair cloth units in the next year. And it's a very powerful tool for supporting new units. So we don't like to give fair cloth away too easily. So you'll see that interplay a little bit as we talk through the option. So just again, fair cloth is calculated based on your operating and capital funding as to, so we can pretty much tell you what a fair cloth subsidy would be worth in Needham. And you can see, we got a little chart down here at the bottom, for seabeds and Captain Cook, you're a little bit higher, $632, and it's a combination of the $423 in operating subsidy and $209 in capital fund. And then it's a little bit lower, but still meaningful at High Rock, $581. So these, this would be available to provide the underlying operating and capital support to a state funded project. And I bet, you probably wonder, it's like, well, why is High Rock lower than Captain Robert Cook and Seabeds, particularly since it's a much older property and has much more extensive needs? When the property came on to the HUD program in 2000, I'm not sure if it was 2011 or 12, that's the date that HUD considers the age of the property. So even though it's much older than it is in reality, for HUD purposes, it's new. And so that's why it gets, $20 per unit less in capital funds in particular. And then the operating subsidy, I think, is just based on the type of housing it is, a difference between single family housing and, walk-ups or detached being the factors there. But yeah, when it's just funny, but you can see, if you had 50 units of fair cloth, then the housing authority's income could be, we could get operating subsidy somewhere between 350 to 380,000. And again, as we're thinking about your entire portfolio and not just your federal side, but thinking about your state side, trying to preserve fair cloth can be a potentially helpful strategy. And then Joe put this slide together, kind of thinking about, it being a slot or a resource that's available to the public housing program. So there are certain programs like RAD in Section 22, where if you switch 5 public housing units to Section 8, you lose, they're gone. You can't develop those anymore. But if you keep your fair cloth, if you do that type of conversion, you get the 5 Section 8 vouchers, but you also reserve your right to potentially develop 5 public housing units. Again, which you could convert to RADs, which might be the right choice to make. But, it just expands the tools that the housing authority would have available. So we can launch into what the options are. I've focused on the options that keep the properties as rental housing. And I think part of that is I've heard, and there may not be as much of an appetite to do home ownership. I know we did home ownership up at High Rock Homes when we did phase 1 up there. But there is a 5th option that's a home ownership option that if there is interest in that, we could explore that more. But we've really been focusing on kind of the options that keep it as rental housing. And these are the 4 that we'll cover in the next series of slides.
I would just say everybody except me and the board weren't around for that discussion of home ownership. So it would be probably something we need to address, maybe not today, but when we get to decision making here.
Sure.
And understand the pros and cons.
Yep. So we're looking at kind of 3 different categories of conversion. There's RAD, the rental assistance demonstration, and your choice there is to do a project-based voucher. Both of them are project-based vouchers. One is a project-based rental assistance voucher that is administered, in the case of Massachusetts, it would be administered by Mass Housing, and they would be the ones who would make your rent determinations, pay out the rent every monthly. They would be the ones that would collect the administrative fee. And the alternative is to do it as a project-based voucher that would be administered by Needham Housing Authority. So there's some slight benefits to the Section 8 project-based rental assistance that allow, for some folks who don't want to run a voucher program, then it's a way for them just to have somebody else run it, and they're just managing the property as a property owner. You guys already have a project-based, or excuse me, a voucher program, so that conceivably you could take on the added responsibility of the project-based vouchers and collect the admin fee for that, and get a little bit of a bump in income, which we think might be beneficial. But those are the two choices that exist under RAD. Under the Section 18 demolition or disposition process, the choices are between project-based voucher that's administered by a housing authority or a tenant-based voucher. And it's dependent upon, what type of Section 18 application that you choose or are eligible for, to whether it would potentially be in this category or would need to be in that category. And then there's a streamlined voluntary conversion. There's one that's offered under Section 18, and then there's one that's offered under Section 22. And in that instance, they would be tenant-based vouchers, with the exception that, a slotted line over here, if a resident, under voluntary conversion, the tenant-based voucher has to be offered first to the resident as tenant-based. But if the resident is willing to consent and make it project-based, then it could convert to a project-based voucher. And in Cambridge, we've done a number of projects where it's been some form of conversion that has landed where it's a tenant-based voucher. And we've done a presentation to the resident community, and we've had over 90% of them consent to make their vouchers project-basse. So there is a process that you could go through, and we've had some success in get at over 90% and getting some resident communities to put their vouchers here. But again, they originally come as these tenant-based vouchers, and you have to go through an added process if you want to project-base them.
I question, why would the tenant want to do that? Why would it be 90%? They had an example in the manual too, 90, higher than that. I mean, it seems to me, if I was a tenant, I would always be better off if I had the voucher myself, right?
Many tenants feel that way, but for many tenants, there's a certitude or certainty of having it be project-based, that they know that they could continue to reside in Needham, at Captain Robert Cook, or wherever, one of your sites, long-term, without any risk of losing that housing. Where if they take a mobile voucher and they may not be able to find an apartment that would meet the rent reasonableness in Needham at the dollar amount that's available and such, and then they might need to then actually move to Framingham or to a community outside of Needham. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of residents really never want to give up their mobile vouchers. And then there's a whole nother group of residents who really want the certainty of being able to stay in the housing that they're in, and they want it to be project-based. And again, worked with a number of private landlords who have had access to these mobile tenant protection vouchers. And we've been able to, have the, once we explain what the choices are, have the residents will, it's really a high percentage, over 90% consent to switching them to project-based vouchers. And there's some amount of residents who really like the idea of knowing that when they move on, the unit will be still available to another family that needs to benefit from the affordability. So there's a generosity piece too with some of that decision making, which is actually not surprising to me, based on some, my interactions with residents.
If somebody gets a tenant-based voucher and then moves somewhere else to Framingham, let's say, and then for whatever reason no longer qualifies or needs a voucher at all, what happens to that tenant-based voucher?
As long as Needham didn't port it out, it would be available to Needham to
Okay.
release.
Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't leave the tenant, or it doesn't leave the housing authority's administration, other than, when you make decisions to port things out or not. So the first option we wanted to talk about is the one that lots of people talk about with it, which is RAD, the rental assistance demonstration. And you'll see we have, you'll see this chart appear a few different times, but we're just kind of comparing what you get for public housing rent. In this example, we're using Captain Robert Cook. What you get for public housing rent per unit per month, and then comparing to that to what you would get to the RAD program. And as I mentioned, RAD is kind of a revenue neutral program. It doesn't really increase in any kind of meaningful way, the income that the housing authority gives. I've gone to so many presentations where they said that it's revenue neutral. Well, it's not quite revenue neutral, because what happens is that HUD will pay the housing authority, if it's the administrator of the voucher, the admin fee that it pays for any Section 8 voucher. So on average, the admin fee can be, anywhere between $80 and $110. So we've kind of landed it around $90 in this example. And that would be an extra payment to the housing authority to basically take on the administrative work to manage the project-based voucher. And so, you've got your rent, your subsidy, your capital fund, and your resident rent in this column for public housing. Your RAD is the combination of operating subsidy and capital fund. They end up right at the same number, 632. Your resident rent doesn't change under RAD. It's calculated the same way, but you do see this little incremental boost of income for the admin fee. So at Captain Robert Cook, over your 30 units there, the extra income is just over $32,000. And here, the project-based, you get that by being the administrator of the project-based vouchers. RAD is currently capped by Congress at 455,000 public housing units. I think initially started out at 165,000, so they've increased it over the last number of years to allow it to serve more units. So there is still capacity there, but it's not an unlimited capacity. The Section 8 contract rents are based on, as we mentioned, the public housing program. The RAD units, the RAD conversion is subject to a long-term Section 8 housing assistance payment contract, which includes automatic renewals. So it's a 20-year contract that HUD is signing and the housing authority is signing, but within that contract, it requires automatic renewals. So the idea is that it's in perpetuity, but it is subject, like public housing program or the current Section 8 program, to appropriations by HUD. So if for some reason HUD decides not to appropriate funding for anything, then it's still subject to appropriations. And that's no different than what it is under public housing, or no different than what um, the voucher program is right now, which is again subject to appropriations. And again, you get that little income boost by the added admin fee. Some of the keys of RAD is, there's the predictable initial contract rents that are based on public housing funding that, as Reg mentioned earlier, would allow access to private sources of capital, whether it is a little bit of debt financing, or the potential of using low-income housing tax credits. To be eligible for RAD, you need to complete a capital needs assessment and demonstrate that the RAD program and its initial contract rents adjusted over time can be sufficient to meet the capital and operating needs of a property for a 20-year period. So they're looking to make sure that what the property needs can actually be met through the RAD program. And so there are some properties that can be met by RAD. In Cambridge, we had 3 properties that we had renovated as part of the Obama ARA funding, the 2008 and 9 funding, that was in very good condition. So when we did our first round of RAD in 2014, those properties didn't need really any immediate work because they had just been done. And then we were able to show that through funding the replacement reserve at this dollar amount, we would be able to cover the full 20 years of the property's operating and capital needs through the RAD conversion. So we converted those properties. We had other properties where, when we did the capital needs assessment, there was not a path forward for us to be able to meet the property's operating and capital needs during that 20-year period. We might have been able to do it for the first 5 or 6 years, but the needs of the property grew over time, that there was not a way we could demonstrate or make the numbers work for us to be able to meet the RAD requirement of that 20-year viability. And we couldn't move forward with RAD. So they became some of the properties that we went another route. We went the Section 18 route, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But the other thing that's key to RAD is that you don't necessarily have to lock it into the location that you're in. You can do it as a rehab of that location. You can demolish and rebuild at that location, or you can transfer the RAD resource to a new location. So there's some flexibility that comes with RAD. I think one of the, oops, I can go back, sorry. One of the nicest things about RAD in my mind, as a person who has worked in public housing for my entire career, is the issues around tenant rights. There's a right to residents to return or continue to live at a RAD converted site. There's a prohibition against rescreening. You can't say, oh, we have to screen you now because it's a new program. If they're your resident as a public housing resident, then they become your resident as a RAD resident. And I think that certainty and guarantee is something that's important to residents, and is a key element of the RAD program. It also allows the public housing organizing and some of the procedural rights that exist in the public housing lease, something like the grievance procedure. It allows those rights to continue, which again, I think certainly in Cambridge were key elements for our resident body. And then as I mentioned, there's that choice mobility requirement, so that after a year, if they're not happy living at Seabeds, they do have the right to request a tenant-based or mobile voucher. And again, depending upon what your wait list is, they do get a priority. but you can only issue out what you have, and so there may be a weight associated with that, but it is a right that they would have. And that is actually something different than that's a betterment, I would say, than what it currently exists under the public housing program. And then the last key to me for RAD is the public stewardship piece of it, which is that under RAD, ownership or control must remain with a public entity or a nonprofit entity, so that there's still very much a role for housing authority to play at a RAD site than perhaps some of the other ones. Again, long-term HAP contracts must be renewed at each expiration, so there's long-term affordability. And then HUD replaces what's called the Declaration of Trust, which is the document that's on the property deed today as a public housing document. They remove that, but they substitute it with a RAD use agreement, which again requires that the land always be used for the purpose of affordable housing. And it defines, affordability as the same as today, which is, serving households at 80% of area median income or below. So those are, some of the key components of RAD that are already put in place, that, some of them in particular are real key, I think, to putting together a strong conversion or repositioning plan. So that's RAD for the moment. We'll come back to RAD in a little bit to talk a little bit more about choices. But I want to switch to the second option, which is Section 18, demolition or disposition. And we've talked about Section 9 being public housing. And it relates. Section 9 is the act in the U.S. Housing Act of 1937 as amended that set up the public housing program. So the Section 18 program is also a component of the Housing Act of 1937 as amended. And it's the portion of that bill that establishes or authorizes the demolition or disposition of public housing under certain criteria. And so it's a very unsexy name for what's going on, but they refer to it as it's the Section 18 to that section in the act. So that's where the name came from, but it really is very much focused on either the demolition or disposition of public housing. And HUD issues out various regulations or notices at times, and the most recent one governing demolition or disposition was released earlier this year in January, I believe, and it's the reference is the public housing notice of 2021, the 07, the 7th notice that came out, and it really kind of outlines in a little bit more specificity exactly how HUD is currently processing and handling demolition and disposition. And it also added some new beneficial tweaks to their process that particularly has some benefit to smaller housing authorities. And we'll talk about that as well as we move forward. So under the Section 18 demolition disposition application process, HUD will generally approve an application for either demolition or disposition if there's health and safety concerns for residents. The example I usually give for that, the public housing property is next to a toxic waste dump that's emitting something in the environment that's not safe. There are other health and safety concerns that would rise to the level where the housing authority, HUD, just needs to get the residents away from the building or from that environment. There's also a physical obsolescence component, and that's been the component that I've done most of the applications in. Basically, submitting documentation to HUD that there's an extensive immediate rehabilitation need at a property that is of a certain dollar amount that makes the property physically obsolete. And HUD has, and again, I don't make any of these numbers up. HUD tells you what that number is, and it's related to a certain percentage of the total development cost. So for some properties, it's 57.14% of the HUD calculated, and you'll see the math in a moment, total development cost for a particular building. Now in Needham, all your buildings are non-elevator buildings, so all of your properties would have to have a total development cost above 57.14% to do any immediate rehab needs. And if you had an elevator building and you don't, that number would be 62.5%. And for for your property, it's somewhere around for seabeds about $125,000 of immediate rehab needs. When you get to High Rock Homes and Captain Robert Cook, it's closer to a little over $200,000 per need. But I'll show you the math in a moment. The other categories, infeasible operation, basically there's a lack of demand for your housing. That's not a category that you guys will qualify for. Many of us in the greater Boston area would qualify for. Scattered site, so for properties that are 4 units or less, and they're not adjacent to each other. HUD recognizes there's a efficiency and effective issues around successful operations. So that has been a category that I've used before. If you're a very small housing authority and you own less than 50 units, then you could go and apply for Section 18 and remove the properties from public housing. And then if you can argue that somehow it's just not efficient or effective to operate as public housing, and again, this is one that's very difficult to meet, then that would be another basis for arguments. But the ones that we've typically used have been the physical obsolescence, the scattered sites, and then we've again worked with a small housing authority that had 50 units or less to transition their units to Section 8 housing. And then there's 2 other component pieces. HUD's Fair Housing and Equal Opportunities Office needs to ensure that the vouchers can be used in your market, not an issue in your market or the greater Boston market. And the other thing that it provides, which RAD does not provide, it provides a phase out of funding under the operating and capital fund programs through 2 programs, one called the asset repositioning fees, that's specific to the operating fund. And then the other one is the demolition disposition transition funds. Gotta check my spelling. I usually say, it's been my experience that between those 2 funds, that's an equivalent of extra income of about $1 million per 100 units of housing. So for every 100 units of housing that Cambridge has moved out of the public housing program through Section 18, we've gotten $1 million of funding through these combined programs, which is really, it's been essential funding for us in terms of being able to make the reinvestments in our properties that we need. And so it's a meaningful funding source. So, the keys for Section 18 is HUD issues new vouchers. They're called tenant protection vouchers to the housing authorities following a Section 18 approval. And you'll hear me refer to these as full value vouchers. They're the kind of vouchers you get when you get mobile vouchers, that are, if you have somebody who's looking for a 1-bedroom apartment, the full value of the voucher is equivalent to an apartment that costs just over $1,900. for a 1-bedroom apartment in the Needham market. So they're not that lower RAD voucher where you're capped at about $1,000 per unit. Here you're capped at closer to $1,900 per unit if it's a 1-bedroom, and much higher if you're a 2, 3, or 4-bedroom. The other thing with some Section 18 conversions is the vouchers can be project-based at the former public housing site at project-based rents. So if you go through the obsolescence arguments, in particular, then you can you'll get your tenant protection vouchers, and you can immediately, without the resident consent, project-base them into your property. So if you were to make the case that Captain Robert Cook met the definition of obsolescence, then you would get 30 tenant protection vouchers that Needham Housing Authority could choose to project base at that site, whether the residents consented or not. There would not be a consent required. And then the last thing, if you do particularly Section 18 obsolescence, you actually maintain your units under fair cloth, right? So you actually don't give back those units. So if, again, you did Captain Robert Cook Road, you would get the 30 tenant protection vouchers. That would become the new way you would fund Captain Robert Cook, but you would retain your rights to those 30 public housing subsidies for potential use elsewhere, or potential use to create future units. So there are certain categories of Section 18 that allow for the project-based project-based basing your vouchers, get that right? And then also ones that allow you to maintain your fair cloth authority. And then I think this just shows you the power of a full value Section 8 voucher that would come to Needham Housing Authority, potentially through, in this case, we did Section 18 obsolescence, using the obsolescence argument. So again, we've showed you the public housing rent, that's what you get today. This would be what you would get under RAD. You just get that little slice of $90 for your admin fee. This would be what the average rent would be at Captain Robert Cook Road, that the housing authority would receive. So the resident rent which is this golden color, stays the same. The admin number stays the same. What changes is the amount that HUD provides the housing authority to operate that same unit. So your annual income at Captain Robert Cook right now is just under $364,000 per year. Under the RAD program, it will go up about $33,000 to $396,000. If you were able to put together a successful Section 18 application, your income would more than double. You would go up to $840,000, almost $841,000. So it would be $477,000 more than what you get right now, which is, I don't need to tell you the power of that extra resource in terms of then your ability to maintain and reinvest, what I like to say, protect and preserve the property. But to be able to qualify for obsolescence, and having done, I think I've done 8 of them so far, it's a challenge. They're not easily done, and you have to really do the work to be successful, and the property needs to qualify. So I just wanted, I'm going to show the math for the other properties at another slide, but just to give you a sense, this is what it would take for Captain Robert Cook to pass, or I guess pass the obsolescence test, or fail the obsolescence test. It would have to have an immediate capital need of just under $6.2 million, which works out to about $206,000 per unit. And if it had that immediate need and we could demonstrate that to our satisfaction, but most importantly to HUD's satisfaction, then you would get access to this column. And again, you know, I've done 8 of these applications, 2 for partnering housing authorities, and I might maybe have done 9 now, 7 for Cambridge and 2 for partnering organization housing authorities, where we've seen this kind of outcome. And you know I know the power of that outcome.
Can I ask a couple questions?
Please.
So looking at that little spreadsheet example at the bottom right, you know, I think I get what you're saying about how hard it is to qualify. How does that apply to what we have actually data on, which we've turned over to you, where we had this, you know, flooding ice dam catastrophe over at seabeds and had to spend, you know, $1 million or $2 million to fix it. And we also spent money on having Cook analyzed and discovered the same construction deficiencies are in the Cook construction. Would those, you know, that $1.5 or $8 million in 2016 or 17 dollars, that would that meet the, you know, help the obsolescence test?
Yeah, I mean, that probably, you know, I think, you know, at the time in 2016, I think, you know, when all said and done, and Gary told us it was somewhere around 55,000 per unit when you dealt with all of the different components of that work. You inflate that for time, you know, you maybe be getting up to $70,000 or $75,000. So that would count against the 206. So then we would just need to see if there's an immediate need that would account for the difference. You know, so if say you're up to 75,000 for just that scope of work alone, then you would have to find other capital needs of about $130,000 per unit.
So that's, you know, I wouldn't call this fortuitous. I wouldn't use that. You know, back then it was a disaster. It was horrible. But from the point of view going forward, you know, had that ice dam issue not happened, we would not have known those construction defects existed in those buildings. And so we wouldn't have that $70,000 that we could use, demonstrate and prove in an application.
Yep.
Needed to be fixed in order to make the buildings safe and to preserve and protect them, as you put it.
Yeah. Yep.
Got it.
Yeah, no, and that's, you know, those are the kind of the key information. And then, you know, and again, we can, you know, I sent my 2 best construction people over to all 3 sites for them to help me figure out whether we thought we should take a push at this and,
Okay.
you know, and try to meet that. And both of them came back, you know, I walk your sites, you know, and I'm, you know, I have a lot of construction experience just by the nature of my job, but I'm not the expert. I really lean on my team that does, but I walk your sites and I'm like, damn, they look pretty good.
Yeah, they do.
You know, you guys have, you know, done some hard work to keep them up. But I also know that, you know, the outside appearances don't match the inside realities. I mean, that's my own experience from the years of running Cambridge's programs. And so that's what I wanted them to come, you know, they know the code, they know, you know, they've been key to my ability to put these applications together. And both of them came away feeling like they thought it was worth our while to really scratch at this obsolescence piece. Maybe a little less on seabeds, but they weren't willing to even concede on that point, to be honest.
Mhm.
But definitely for Captain Robert Cook in particular, and maybe even at High Rock. But you'll see it's interesting because there are other paths to getting to this full value Section 8 voucher that may not be as hard to reach. Some that keep your fair cloth authority, some that would actually say you have to give it away. And those are the kinds of things that, You know, you'll see someplace along the way, we'll say to you, the more you can get your units into this category, I mean, I don't have to sell you on this, the better it is for Needham Housing Authority in terms of outcome, because it just gives you more resources, and more resources gives you more choice. But you've got to see, you know, there's a timing issue of access, and then there's, you know, what are the hoops that you would need to do to get that. But this gives you a sense for at least one of your properties. And again, we in one of the later slides, we actually show all 3 properties, so you can have a sense of what it looks like for seabeds, what it looks like for, again, for Captain Robert Cook, but also what it looks like for High Rock as well. So the third option is taking RAD and Section 18 and blending them together. And this was something that didn't exist when RAD first came out in 2013 and 14. It actually didn't exist until 2018. And I think it reflects both my experience, Cambridge's experience with it, but I think the experience that HUD was seeing across the nation, where we realized that RAD would work for certain things, but RAD wouldn't work for all things. And so by doing this blended approach, I think it allows for, housing authorities to be, you know, selective in combining of the 2 resources in a way that can allow the entire property go, you know, the entire agency to go forward. So at the end of the day, you know, Cambridge will have been about 50% RAD and 50% Section 18. And that's what it's going to take to get, you know, all of the major renovation improvements, kind of that protecting and preserve element that the repositioning and conversion has done for us in Cambridge. That's good. That will be the outcome in Cambridge, 50-50. And so, you know, HUD is now, you know, HUD came out in 2018 and said, all right, we're willing to do blending, but it will be 75% RAD and 25% Section 18. So you still get the lower Section 8 rents for the 75 units, but you can get for 25% of the units to higher rents. In January of this year, in 2021, they modified it again, and they made it even more flexible. So depending upon the physical condition needs of your site, and again, it's not as stringent as the Section 18 calculation, but it still has a threshold test you have to have. You could potentially do 40% of your units as those lower RAD units and 60% as those higher Section 18. And then there's even in our market, the possibility of doing 20% of your units as RAD and getting 80% of your units as Section 18. So, you know, if that were to happen in Needham, you know, 80% of 136 units is 109, rounding up 109 new Section 8 vouchers. And then you would keep the balance as those RAD vouchers. You would run the property all the same. It would all be RAD, you know, it would all be voucher housing, project-based voucher housing. It's just that you would, for 80% of the units, you would get that that higher rent that I showed on the earlier slide. And so this RAD blended piece is a really interesting component, because if you do RAD blended, that 20-80 split or that 40-60, any unit that's Section 18 keeps its fair cloth. All right, so you get the benefit of that higher Section 8 rent, but you also get the benefit of keeping your fair cloth. Now, just to make it as complicated or as interesting as you for you guys, there's a provision for smaller housing authorities where if you're in this, Needham absolutely qualifies for this. If you have under 250 public housing units, at PHA's discretion, up to 80% of the units can be disposed of under Section 18. And you don't have to pass any kind of construction threshold test or anything. you could just automatically, as of right, get 80% of those full value Section 8 vouchers. The caveat is you got to give up your fair cloth and you've got to close out your federal public housing program. But you could immediately see your income jump up and be supported, 109 of your units supported by these full value Section 8. And you'll see, again, the math is coming, so stay tuned. So for the non, if you don't take advantage of the small public housing one, then you have to demonstrate to get these blends that you have a specific housing construction cost need that is for each of the properties. And again, the threshold numbers are much more manageable than obsolescence. So it's much more likely that you would get, I would not expect to do just a RAD, outright RAD. I would expect to do a RAD blended if we were to go in that direction at all. And then a couple of caveats is that you have to meet both the RAD and Section 18 program requirements. You can't use 9% credits, which Massachusetts isn't providing for RAD deals. And again, with the exception of the small blends, you do keep your fair cloth. And again, another spelling error. So just to give you a sense of what it would take to do a RAD blend in Needham. So they have 3 different thresholds. So if your rehab costs are between, for seabeds, $40,000 per unit, at either Captain Robert Cook or High Rock, $63,000 per unit, which I think both of those are reachable. Then 20% of the units at each of the sites would be Section 18. Then they have the 60% of housing construction costs, which again, just in dollar amounts for your properties, it's $77,000 for seabeds and 126 for family. And the difference is they do it by bedroom size. So seabeds is all 1 bedroom, so it's always going to be lower. But for High Rock and Captain Robert Cook, there's 2 3s. And in the case of Captain Robert Cook, 4-bedroom units, which is why you're seeing the per unit count so high, much higher at family units, because HUD recognizes it costs more to construct properties. But if you can meet these thresholds, and I think for your family sites, that should be reachable. Captain, seabeds, I mean, Goran and Dan, my 2 construction folks, said they thought that they could get to 77,000 pretty easily at seabeds as well. Then 40% of your units would be those full value Section 18s. And then the last threshold for these RAD blended transactions is if the construction cost is 90% of the housing construction cost that HUD publishes, then you could get 60%. But you see my little asterisk, because we live in a high cost market that's been identified by HUD, at 90%, then a housing authority could actually qualify for 80% Section 18. So this would be another path. Instead of going the 250 unit path, we would see if you would qualify with the rehab costs as shown, 116,000 for seabeds, 190,000 for the family sites, and then we could access the 80% Section 18. And again, these Section 18s on the traditional RAD Section 18 blend are maintain your fair cloth rather than give away your fair cloth. But then, as I mentioned, there's the RAD Section 18 closeout blend. So we worked with the Watertown Housing Authority to close out. They had just 50 units of federal public housing, and there was not a way for them to obsolescence. There was not a way for them to qualify for RAD blended. They made the choice. We helped them with their application, and they just removed all of their 50 units out of public housing, got the full value Section 8 vouchers, but are closing out their federal public housing program. And then you have the 250 unit one, but so I mean that they give you a lot of different options, so it's a kind of plug and play. that can be, you just got to work. You'll say we got a lot of math to do, which we've been doing to figure out what's the most advantageous for Needham Housing Authority. And then the last one, and then we'll go into at least a little bit more of the math behind your story, is the Section 22. And again, it's going back to the 1937 Housing Act to its name, but it's called voluntary conversion, which allows housing authorities to convert to vouchers by demonstrating that it will be less costly to operate the properties with vouchers than under public housing. So, I know of 2 housing authorities that have gone that route. Actually, over a number of years ago, Keene, New Hampshire, went through a voluntary conversion of their vouchers, and they demonstrated to HUD that it was going to be less costly to operate the property with the vouchers. And San Diego did the same. But there's a real threshold of having to demonstrate that it is less costly. That can be a real challenge to meet. But in HUD's efforts to, again, incentivize housing authorities to convert, they've come up with a streamlined voluntary conversion process. Again, it's outlined in Notice 2019-05 that basically waives the cost test for smaller housing authorities. Again, Needham would fit into this category, but it's for smaller housing authorities that wish to close out their public housing program. So that's, again, you're giving away your fair cloth, you're closing out your federal public housing program. This program, the Section 22, is the one instance where the tenant protection vouchers are tenant-based. You can't just project-base them right into the property like you can do with the Section 18 approvals. So residents must provide written consent to permit the project basing. So this is kind of the wrinkle of this one. How worried are you that you're going to have residents who say no? And then what are you going to do to provide the subsidy for the units that the residents say no to if they take their vouchers and leave? Residents could remain at the property with their tenant-based voucher if the property is going to be continued used for residential. So they could keep their tenant-based voucher and their unit for as long as they want. But then if they decide in 2 years or 5 years that they want to, move to California, believe it or not, or move to Framingham, either, they could take their Section 8 voucher with you, and then Needham Housing Authority would be left with a unit that did not have an operating subsidy, but still had a requirement to serve low-income
And
families.
question, so suppose that happened, would another tenant with a housing choice voucher be eligible to come and live, or a
Potentially,
tenant-based
you would.
voucher?
Yeah,
And
you
then,
would.
and then you get the subsidy back, so it just makes it a little more complicated to lease out that unit.
But that's exactly one of the fallback positions. Would be to market to a mobile voucher holder.
Which wouldn't necessarily need to be a Needham voucher. It could be a voucher holder from somewhere else.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Again, Fair Housing Equal Opportunity does their review to ensure the vouchers can be used in the market. That, again, is not an issue for our market. And the takeaway is it represents the same income boost as with the Section 18, except it's portfolio wide. So you got to agree to do it everywhere. It reduces your fair cloth, it eliminates it, and it requires you to close out your public housing program. So then just, kind of doing a summary of what's available to small or very small housing authorities. So you guys fall into the small category. So you're eligible for the streamline Section 22 voluntary conversion, and you're eligible through, to do a small RAD blended transaction where you get 80% of your vouchers. Those are like 2 special things that, as a small agency you would be able to do. But I mean, you can keep title to your property under RAD or Section 22. For Section 18, oftentimes they ask housing authorities to create a new entity that would still be controlled by the housing authority, but would be more like a limited liability corporation, and then with the exception of Section 18, you can project base. For Section 22, again, you have to get consent from the resident. And then the other important element for Section 22, I just want to park in your head, is that a family is rescreened for eligibility under the Housing Choice Voucher Program, and they have to be earning less than 80% of area median income to actually qualify for a voucher. So you have, and Cambridge has, a handful of residents who may be above 80% of area median income. So that would be a factor that we would want to study a little bit more to determine how many families might be impacted by that, because they would not be eligible for the Housing Choice Voucher Program. And the Housing Authority would take on some requirements of providing a relocation to a comparable unit for them. And so that's, again, a wrinkle to the Section 22 component as well. So just to speed up a little bit, because we're in the last half hour. Are these conversions worth it? And the answer is absolutely. These avenues can lock down higher capital funding, can stabilize operational income. They can really generate an incredible boost in income. And then it opens up, as we've talked about, the possibility of leveraging the value of the Needham portfolio for reinvestment and resource expansion. Just bringing more money to maintain what you have and then potentially expand on what you have. The caveats are they have to make financial sense. They need to be adapted to the housing authority, the residents, the property. They need to meet your local needs. I like to say you don't want to do RAD for the sake of converting, or it has to make financial sense, and it has to make sense within your framework of what your goals and objectives are for the agency. And then to figure out which option makes sense, you really have to look at the physical needs, the capital needs of the portfolio, look at a little bit of the resident information, as I mentioned, to see if you have a large number of folks who might be over income. And then you got to just, check and double check and do a lot of math to, prove out, what are some of the best, what are the best options available. And then out of those best options, what are the pluses and minuses, the advantages or disadvantages of each of those options. And then just this does a little bit of the math. I just wanted to, we're still very much in the thick of doing this, and we're still looking to lock down some information, but I wanted to kind of give you a sense of some of the viability testing that is happening to determine which are the best options. So as I mentioned with RAD, the viability test is that a property must meet its capital needs for the 20-year period. In other words, that whatever repairs you have to do up front, you can fund them. And then whatever repairs you need to do over 20 years, you can fund. So say you had just, like at Seabeds, you had done the roof in 2016, 2015 as part of the ice dams. You don't need to do that roof again until 2035 or 2036. So you're not going to do that scope of work. But you're going to need, since that's going to fall in that 20-year window, you're going to need to be able to show that you're going to have funding in 2036 to be able to pay for that roof. So you have to look at not only what your immediate needs are, but then what's going to come due in that 20-year period. And you need to make sure that you can pay your everyday bills, your operating bills, but also pay for when that capital work comes, which I think, to me, caring most about making sure we protect the assets, which really what we're doing is protecting homes for your families. It's a really important measure to take. And if it doesn't meet the 20-year needs, then it's not the right option for you. Or for the housing authority. And again, we had some properties in Cambridge that we could get to meet, and we got them to meet the 20-year threshold requirements, and we had the other ones that didn't. We did some of them, Brad, and then we went and looked for other resources or other ways to do the other properties, so that we could make sure we were making the best decisions for the properties, and translating that to the best decisions to the families or the individuals that live in the housing. It can be a hard test for properties to meet that have not been through a recent comprehensive modernization. So seabeds might be the easier of the three, because it has had, the recent reinvestment on the roof stuff, but it does certainly have a bunch of other needs. And then usually RAD needs the resources from the low-income housing tax credits. And you'll see in my little example here, we are projecting tax credits for each of the three properties, and you can see, it has the potential to raise as much as $14 million of outside private investment to support Needham housing authorities. Sorry, I clicked and I went in the wrong direction. My apologies. So what this chart is showing is, what the mortgages can support as just a straight up RAD deal. So not a blended deal or anything like that. And you can see the properties can't support a whole lot of mortgages or mortgage amount. Really, all you're mortgaging is the amount that you're getting from your capital fund, and mortgaging it over time. And that's worth about $4 million. So it's not a big number. The big number really is the tax credits. And then because we didn't have we don't have good information yet on what the construction needs are for that 20-year test, I just kind of put a baseline number in, which was the construction estimate using HUD's 60% of housing costs, construction costs. So that's what each of these numbers are. And then just building out the rest of the financial pro forma to reflect the other cost of the projects. I don't know if those are gonna be enough to meet the capital needs for 20 years. I'm gonna say at a combined number of $108,000. Based on my experience, the answer is gonna be no, it's not gonna be enough. It's gonna be higher than that. You may not have an immediate need of the higher amount, but over that 20-year period, I've been seeing kind of across the industry in our market, that number being closer to, probably $200,000 per unit. So then, it would show a greater gap than I'm showing now. But it doesn't assume any Section 8, doesn't assume any full value Section 8 vouchers. So, if we are at this level, that 60% of housing choice vouchers, then 40% of the units could be full value Section 8 vouchers, which would really change the profile on what could be borrowed. And I've actually done the math. Have it open. So this, I have it on I'd have to get out of my PowerPoint, so I can answer that question after. But it probably would increase your mortgage, what you can support, by 12 to $14 million, and go a long way to solving the funding gap. But these are the kinds of exercises that we do to kind of determine viability. But the piece that we're still missing is, why we got it. The facilities management study did a good job at cataloging things. It actually didn't provide a cost estimate, and nor did it kind of do the deeper dive of that 20-year viability piece. And you see, that's one of the tests that we're working on to perform now as part of our ongoing work. For section
Can I ask
18,
Are you running out of time enough?
No.
Too
I've
much
got
of a
18 more
question?
minutes. I can stay as long, my time is your time. So, but I'm mindful of your time being 12 o'clock. I have more time, obviously. I can keep going, but and I have about 7 more slides.
If we run over a little bit to everybody, is that okay?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Then I would go back to the previous
Yeah,
slide,
that's
because
it.
this is something that I think, and this is where the recording is going to help us, or at least help me here. I realize the numbers here are just purely for illustration. And you're working on, getting the actual capital needs assessments done on a formal basis. And that's, I mentioned to the board that that's one of the things that you're developing a scope of work.
Yep.
And we'll be hiring house doctors to do. So I get that. But just to understand what the top down, what these slides are showing, it's showing that with a seabeds is with $10,898,000 worth of sources of funds, and 11313 is close to meeting or not meeting the test. And whereas if I go over to High Rock, again, using this as an illustration, the difference between sources and uses is almost $5 million. That would definitely meet the test. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I would say almost the opposite. That's, that based on this analysis,
Mhm.
and again, there's a lot of plug numbers, so it's
Yeah.
illustrative, as you said. Seabeds and Captain Robert Cook are closer to meeting the requirements for a RAD blend
Right.
than High Rock. And so then the question,
It will never come close, because you could never support the 20-year capital needs.
other than, so right now, what's not factored in here is I could, because I'm at 60%, what I plugged in as a number, just as an illustrative number, was 60% of the housing construction costs.
Mhm.
So that would qualify all 3 of them right now for a RAD blend,
Mhm.
which would bring 40% of section 18 or section 8 vouchers to
Mhm.
the table. Now with High Rock, if we could get if the number was more, not 60%, but 90% of this housing construction cost number,
Right.
then we could get 80% section 8 vouchers. And if you hold on. I was just seeing if I could pull up my other spreadsheet that
No,
showed.
I don't want to bog us down. I
Yeah.
just trying to understand slide 23 there. You really, that number needs to be close to 0, the different number.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, we'll be able to plug in the actual number once we get good information on what the 20-year capital needs is
That was
going to
my
be.
question. So please keep going on
All
there.
right. So you still can you still see the slide, my slide?
Yes,
Okay,
but you need to expand it to full screen.
Thank you. There we go. All right. So then just, so we looked at what the RAD kind of a viability test would be, that 20-year period. So for section 18, again, focusing on obsolescence, the property must have immediate needs. And again, HUD is very stringent about what immediate is defined as. It's work that needs to happen within the next 3 years. So like the example they'll give is say, all right, your bathtubs are original, but they're still functional. Unless you can demonstrate that they're failing, even though they're 50, in the case of seabeds, they're 50 years old, just because they're ready to be replaced now because they've lived their lifespan, unless they're rusted and pitted and whatever, that's not immediate. So they really make it hard and they make it stringent. And then you have to then really document it. Now, again, my team has gotten very good at making those cases and one, assessing if the case can be made, and then putting together the actual funding, the application to compel HUD to approve it. But it is, I'm not going to tell you to go down this road unless I'm convinced we can prevail. And that will be some of the information that we will be getting from these capital needs studies. But just to give you a sense, again, for each of the 3 sites, what we would have to meet, and again, all 3 of your properties fall into the category of this, it must be 57.1% of the total development cost. And each site has a different total development cost because it's based on the unit mix and the type of construction. And so for seabeds, the per unit construction cost to meet obsolescence would be 129,000 rounding up. And then for Captain Cook in High Rock, you're at 2065 and 2096. So these are the numbers we'll be watching as we do the, get the physical needs study to see how close we can get to those numbers. And it's just, a little inside baseball is these are the per unit numbers that we need to hit. But to get to these numbers, HUD does allow for some markup. So there's, they say, all right, you can have a 7.5% contingency in your number. You can have a 2% PHA admin fee, 5.5% for A&E fee. So when you actually subtract the add-ons that they allow, the construction number for seabeds goes down to about 111,000. And for Captain Robert Cook and High Rock, it becomes more like 180 to 183,000. And that the markups get us to the right number. And so that, so there is a little bit of room, that makes me think that 180 number actual construction with the markups getting us up to 206 to 209 has some potential. And that's certainly what my construction experts on my staff advised as well. And then the blend testing, and we talked a little bit about that. So HUD defines it as slightly different. Instead of it being total development cost, which is a higher number, they're using an already lower number, which is the housing construction cost. And instead of it being 57.14% of TDC, total development cost, they're doing 30, 60, and 90 as their test. And you can see here for your 3 properties where those numbers fall out. And interestingly enough, the 90% falls pretty close to the obsolescence test. But the difference between obsolescence and the RAD blended is that immediate definition goes away. So, where I can only count bathtubs at seabeds if they're pitted and rusted and in really poor condition that they need immediate replacement, under the blended test, because they're beyond their useful life and they need to be replaced, I can count that cost as a construction cost. So it's a little bit easier test to meet. The thresholds are a little bit easier. I certainly would think we would qualify for one of these blendeds. And it's just a question of whether we think we qualify for 60 or 90. And again, 90 is very interesting because, we're in a high cost market identified and by HUD, so we would get up to, we would get 80% Section 18. And then just as a reminder, the more Section 18 we can get, the better, because we're going to get that big bump of income.
But give up the fair cloth.
In this instance, you don't give up the fair
You
cloth.
don't give up the fair cloth. Okay.
Don't give up the fair cloth. Excellent question. Section 22. Again, there's actually no viability test required. So, it's available for the taking. But it has the potential of the full value Section 8 vouchers. You'll see in just a moment what that boost of income looks like. But again, it requires the closeout of public housing. It takes away the possibility of fair cloth. And as we mentioned, you can only project-based voucher with resident consent. I'll come back to this in a moment, but I want to show you this slide. So this is basically the slide that the team put together that shows you what happens to your total income based on which avenue you take or pathway you take. So right now you're in this public housing program where, you know, this is kind of in the range of what you're operating your property at. You know, it works out over the 136 units to $960 per unit per month. You know, RAD, as we talked about, you get a little bump because of the new admin fee. I mean, you're basically the same right here, because again, it's revenue neutral, but you do get the admin fee, and that brings your per unit month up by $90, represents a 9% increase. These two columns represent two of the three RAD blended options that we modeled. So we did the 60% housing construction costs, where you would get 40% Section 18 and 60% RAD. And you could see your income go from $1.5 million, $1.56 million to 2.8, a 79% increase, big increase on your PUM. If you're able to get to an 80-20 blend, 80% Section 18 and 20% RAD, you're at 102% increase, 1943 per unit per month, you know. And then the big one, you get 100% Section 18 vouch or Section 8 vouchers, full value vouchers, either through Section 18, where you have obsolescence, or you could do the small area, the small PHA. Well, the small PHA gets you into this category. So obsolescence gets you 100%. And then Section 22, where you have to get resident consent and close out your public housing program, you know, gets you over $3.5 million of income, which is 126% overall increase. So, you know, the takeaway here is that there's real opportunity to really change the bottom line funding that Needham Housing Authority gets to operate the same units you have today. And that bump of income, you know, is somewhere in this projected. And you could go absolutely as high as this right now under Section 22. The rubs are, you know, the issues around consent and project basing vouchers and closing out your fair cloth units. Or you can land in this column, if we can make obsolescence as an argument and keep your fair cloth and just by right project base your vouchers in, or we could land in these columns. But, you know, I don't think you'll be anything less than one of these two columns. And it's just a question of how we try to maneuver through and protect your fair cloth units to the extent that we can. And then I just want to go back to the slide I skipped, just because this offers a really nice summary. Let me make it large again, about kind of where some of the choices lie. These are the different programs. We've covered all of them with the exception of the home ownership. And if you want, we can come back to that and do something very, you know, at maybe one of your regular meetings specific to that, if you want to go down that pathway. But it tells you whether you're eligible for tenant protection vouchers. For RAD, the answers are no, because you're doing a RAD voucher. You are getting a Section 8 voucher, but it's not a tenant protection voucher. With Section 18, whether it's a RAD blend or obsolescence, you are getting a tenant protection voucher, which is a new revenue, a new source increase of funding. You know, you're going from, you know, the RAD voucher funding amount to, as I said, the full value voucher that's so valuable. And you can see where you're getting the yeses for that. This is the kind of repositioning, the funding that you would get under certain categories where they're funding you as you're transitioning out of public housing. For RAD, you don't get that, and again, in Cambridge, it worked out to be about $1 million per 100 units housing, but you do get that under Section 18, but you do not get it under Section 22, these last two. Talks about resident rights to return. And again, the resident rights are stronger under the RAD programs than the Section 18. And part of the difference is that the RAD programs, as I mentioned, bring over some of the public housing rights, where the Section 8 program or the Section 18 programs in Section 22, they don't bring over the rights in the same way because they're moving you very formally to the actual Section 8 program. So then you're bound by the Section 8 program requirements. Whether, Needham would be able to grandfather in some of the procedural rights and protections to Section 18 or Section 22. I think so. I think the right of return is one area that we would need to focus a little bit more study on. And then, our replacement housing required. So I'm sorry, I make the click in it. It's me on the wrong page. There even, RAD says yes, but there, even when these say no, there is a relocation component that the families become eligible under the Uniform Relocation Act, and the Housing Authority has responsibilities there. So it just triggers a different set of compliances that could still result in the replacement housing being the same housing as you have now. And then, how you can use, if there's any sale proceeds, can you use public housing program funds? Does the resident need to consent to PBV? You get down here to the yes. And then this is, does it reduce fair cloth? Do you have to remove all your programs required? So this is like a helpful cheat sheet to kind of understanding some of the yin and yang of the different conversion options. We've looked at the benefits by program. And then this is my quick summary of things. RAD by itself, so only a small increase in income, and you've got the 20-year viability. RAD blended is increasingly helpful, and any Section 18 keeps fair cloth. So you keep seeing me come back to fair cloth. Section 18 is very helpful, especially if it's obsolescent, since it keeps fair cloth, but you've got to pass the test, and it needs to be convincing. And again, it only covers that meaningful work. And then again, you've got your small blended at your discretion. You can go right to, if we're on a monopoly board, to go and get 80% of your units converted to the full value Section 18, but you have to agree not to use fair cloth. And then that we didn't focus on but it is it's in the public housing notice of 2021-07 that this would affect Needham, because it says any PBV contract created under this option must be administered by a housing choice contract administrator with at least 250 HCV units. So if I remember correctly, you guys are somewhere around 120.
Yes.
So if you go in this category, you don't get to administer your own vouchers. You would need to partner up with another housing authority to administer those vouchers, which is strange because they don't have the same requirement that I've seen under Section 22. And then, the 50 units we won't cover, but the streamlined Section 22, again, has the program for 250 units. Very helpful. but no fair cloth, and then comes with constraints. And again, I don't think this will impact you. You know, you only get TPVs for units occupied within the last 24 months, and then the project basing is permissible with tenant consent. And then just, I didn't want to not talk about resident processor requirements specific to conversion or repositioning, because I think resident engagement in this process is ultimately critical to answering any questions or concern, but also getting residents to really understand the benefits to the housing authority and to them in terms of then the housing authority's ability to maintain, protect, preserve the housing. Some particular programs, the RAD program in particular, requires that the housing authority notify every resident that is submitting a RAD application, and you need to do a public hearing and solicit any comments. You know, obviously describe your program. And I would actually, even if it's not required, I would advise to do it. I just think it's good practice, whether it's required or not, to have a public hearing or a public process that allows resident inputs. You know, again, some programs have very specific requirements, while others are not as specific, but I think letting everybody know what you're doing and why you're doing it, and answering the tough questions or and the questions that are impactful to their your family's everyday lives is a really important element. Others just require consultations where you just need to consult with residents prior to applying. So the Section 18 or the streamlined voluntary conversion is more of a consultation process. You don't need to hold a public hearing per se, but again, I would still go that route. But in both instances, you need to provide evidence of consultations, and if you've gotten any comments by residents, you provide them to HUD as well. And usually we usually provide comments back to the residents on their comments. In terms of impact on resident housing assistance, so the Section 18 or the streamlined voluntary conversion means the public housing lease will end and the housing authority must offer a comparable housing assistance. It could be Section 8 housing choice voucher, it could be Section 8 project-based voucher. But the lease, and as I mentioned, some of the tenant protection elements are not going to necessarily match exactly the public housing, because it will be based on the Section 8 platform, and that can cause some concern amongst resident populations. And then the big wrinkle is if you have a household who's over income for the voucher program, where their income is over 80% of area median income, they're not going to qualify for housing assistance. But the PHA still has the requirement of offering comparable housing. And so you don't, they're not, there's still responsibility on the housing authority's part, but, conceivably you're saying to a person, geez, your income is over the income requirements of Captain Robert Cook Road, so you're going to need to move by a date certain time, and we'll help you move, and we're going to offer you some comparable housing, but at the end of the day, you can't stay at this exact site. And again, I think I would be shocked if you don't have a handful of people who would fit this, who would be over 80% of area median income, but that's something that we've got to identify on. And then for residents, would there be an impact on rents? For the most case, not. The rents would be calculated the same exact way by any of these conversions as they are now. However, with public housing, oftentimes public housing authorities have ceiling rents or flat rents, where a person might be over 80% of area median income, or maybe they're on the higher end, but not over 80%, but they're at your maximum ceiling rent. So they're in effect paying less than 30% of area median income. Those families may experience an increase since the Section 8 rents don't allow for ceiling rents or flat rents. They're truly income based. So if 30% of your income is $2,200 and you're living in a 3-bedroom apartment at Captain Robert Cook or High Rock, the Section 8 rent will probably be $2,500. So they would pay their 30% share, $2,200, and the subsidy from HUD would be just the difference. Right now, they may be on a ceiling rent and they might be capped off at, and I don't know your ceiling rents, but from what I could see from the rent rolls, it's somewhere around I don't know, $1,400 or $1,500. Those folks would, on those higher income bands, potentially experience an increase. In Cambridge, we've handled those kinds of cases. Where we do a gradual increase over a 3 or 5 year period to lessen the immediate impact of it, but eventually they do go up to that higher band or that higher level. But we do it on a rolling basis rather than an immediate shock. So that could be an option here. And then just some final considerations, things I like to say. All of this is whether you stay in public housing or you convert to the Section 8 platform, there's appropriation risk. I can't ever tell you that you're not going to have a cut or you're not going to experience something different, because it's all, both public housing and Section 8 are subject to congressional appropriations. And historically the Section 8 program hasn't suffered the same cuts as public housing. Again, there's no guarantee what our future looks like. At varying different times, I've heard doomsday scenarios that, to get the debt under control, we're going to have to cut all of our support service type programs from Congress. And I hope that never happens. But again, if you're at a higher level funding, as you saw, there's an example where, your funding could be 126% higher than it currently is. Your ability to withstand cuts will be much greater. So, while there is appropriation risk, I don't think it should be key to stopping you from moving forward. Again, any switch to the Section 8 program means you don't receive any more capital funding. So your capital fund program goes away. But again, hopefully with the decisions you're making with RAD, you're meeting that 20-year viability test. You're showing the funding to actually pay for all those costs upfront and in a predictable way. And then with the Section 8 program, you're going to just get general more predictable funding, and you'll find that you'll actually have more control, more resources, more reserves, so that more things will be in the control of the housing authority than HUD. Again, I think resident consultation is key and critical. I would recommend consulting with residents throughout the process. I think I've told the story before, so it's worth repeating. The reason we got resident buy-in and consent to both our RAD and Section 18 disposition processes in Cambridge was that we had met numerous times explaining the programs, why we were considering it, what they, and very, very transparent about what's good about it, what's bad about it, how we're going to mitigate the bad to, take advantage of the good, so that when we actually made the decision to do RAD, and we did it, I think we decided in September of 2013 to apply. We did all of our resident notification, got resident, support in a 6-week process, but we had done so many other meetings before then that it was no new news. It was all good news from the resident standpoint. I also like to address the staffing reductions or changes. RAD or another form of Section 18 conversion itself doesn't equate a result in staff reduction or changes, though some housing authorities have gone that route. So, I usually use Baltimore as my example here, where they basically have transitioned all of their owned properties to nonprofit partners, and they're now just administering the Section 8 vouchers. They didn't want to do property management or maintenance anymore, but that was a choice they made. Now, Cambridge has gone the opposite, totally opposite route, where we don't want to give up our management and maintenance functions. Our residents, that was a key element, did not want us to give up our management and resident functions. So, part of your decision making is going to be, which form of this do you want to go, and how much do you want to keep with what's been what you have in place now with your staffing. There are going to be programmatic changes. One benefit of going potentially 100% Section 8 is that instead of having to administer a Section 8 program and a federal public housing program, you basically get rid of one entire program and you're just doing Section 8. And there's an administrative ease to that. You don't need to have staff who have knowledge on both programs, and administratively that could be more efficient. If you're doing low-income housing tax credits, the way you calculate income and rents change. So your staff has to be trained to be able to take on those added responsibilities. So in Cambridge, we've made some changes to our staffing to provide better services to the residents and to manage the added risk associated with the use of tax credits. But we've actually maintained, or actually, I think now more than slightly increased our staffing since we started our conversion in 2014. And more than slightly has happened really in the last couple of years, and is a function in the fact that we actually have the revenue to support the additional staff that we didn't have before. So it was a good news opportunity. And then I always like to, we always got to be ready for opportunities. So you want to take advantage of opportunities, but you want to look for opportunities that are going to strengthen your agency, your local community's mission towards affordable housing. And you want to do your homework, which is really what today is all about, helping you guys get kind of a sense of what these options are, what some of the pluses and minuses are, and getting you in the position as we continue to do our work to help you evaluate the different pathways forward, that when we start coming in with the actual firm details, not illustrative, you'll be in the position to help guide us, to help you make the best decision for Needham Housing Authority, the Needham Housing Authority residents, and the overall communities. And then I think this is my last slide, is just what our next steps are. So our next steps are to confirm and quantify the capital needs as each site. Reggie mentioned that. Where does the overall need fit against the conversion options? So we're actually using one of our house doctors that we've already hired, but we're coming up with the scope of work that will, for them to perform, which you guys will review and approve before we give them the okay to move forward, for them to identify the work and identify, most importantly, the cost needed to complete that work. We're going to do more analysis. So once we know with some certainty the immediate need and the up to 20-year need per property, we'll further assess how to maximize the full value of Section 18 tenant protection vouchers. Continue to explore Section 18 and see if there's can't be a case for obsolescence. Look at RAD and RAD blended to see if there's a path there that would potentially be worthwhile because of the preservation of fair cloth, and continue just to explore the potential of the Section 22, which is kind of the pathway that gets you to 100% Section 8 full value vouchers, but comes with a few different rubs, and then evaluate, so you guys will understand and appreciate the potential value of any fair cloth units we're able to maintain, both near term and then over time, and then to determine, at the end of the day, we're going to be probably evaluating, well, does it make sense just to get the full Section 22 thing done, or do the Section 18 80%, but give up our fair cloth and our public housing program? Or does it make sense to try to do something that protects or preserves those fair cloth units so that they're available, potentially for some of your state redevelopment efforts, or some of your opportunities to add new units, whether it's at the Seabed Captain Robert Cook campus or elsewhere in Needham or what have you. So I think that gets us to the end.
Thank you.
so much, Margaret. That's amazing. I think I feel like I've been drinking from the fire hose, not even sipping from the fire hose, but really appreciate it. We're obviously 15, 17 minutes over time. Do people want to take a little time to ask questions now? Or we could also let people who have to go peel off and keep asking questions here, and that will be recorded. You can listen to later. Or we could say that there's only so much of this we can absorb, in one sitting. And people could like send questions. We could, if you have follow-up questions that you already have on your mind, you think of tomorrow, we could aggregate those and give them to Margaret and just get answers to them, in a Q&A fact things. What's the will of everybody here?
I just want to thank her for, excuse me, her presentation and providing all the differences in the programs that are out there. She did a fantastic job. So
Great. Yeah.
I'll stay as long.
So which way, and also Margaret, would it be possible for you to share your PowerPoint?
Absolutely. Yeah.
We can
And
put that
what we're
on.
building towards too is even, like my goal is always to try to get something down to 1 or 2 pages.
Yeah.
And so as we get more Needham specific information, then what I can imagine coming as a matrix
Yeah.
of 2 pages that would really provide Needham specific information and then really highlight the advantages and disadvantages of each of the options,
Right.
so that you can start to really see a little bit more visual ease, I think, some of that, but we're still very much in the evaluation stage. And, my goal today really was to kind of introduce the 4 main component, options. But and then at some point you guys will have to help me kind of understand. I have my own biases of, I want to, get you as much income as possible, which, there's a lot of good news there because, there's a number of different paths that are really going to change your bottom line. But then, I also do appreciate the value of those Faircloth units, and the potential, particularly for your state portfolio, of how that could be really beneficial to some repositioning strategies there. But hearing some feedback from you on some of those things will really help me kind of help you do with the analysis to get you into a position, not for a little bit, because we still have a bit of work to do, but when you are going to make the decision, to make sure we've done our best to give you the tools and information and the analysis that you feel ready to make a decision.
So again, let me just put a stake in the ground here with my question. I think we're not going to boil the ocean all at one time with all this stuff. It's going to be iterative. I would recommend, and see if everybody thinks this is the right to go, that people who've taken notes or have questions in their head, jot them down this weekend while it's still clear in your, so you still remember them. Margaret, can get me the presentation and I'll send it around to jog your memory.
Yeah.
And then we'll aggregate them and send them off to Margaret and the team for answers, rather than trying to continue now. Does that sound like the right way of going here?
Yes.
Yes.
Sure.
And we will also just let you know, one of the things we've been working on, both Cambridge and ourselves over the summer, is building a repository, a project repository of documents that is in it's called Box, is the one that Cambridge used. It's like Dropbox, and it's accessible. and we'll not only send the the presentation around, but and make it available to recording, but we'll also stash the recording in there. So if you want to come back to it, you can find it. You don't have to keep track of all this stuff completely on your own, because this is the beginning, I believe it's fair to say, I remember from Marion, of a flood of paper that is coming your way over the next year or two. That a fair statement, Margaret? Yeah. So I'm thinking, Margaret, we want to have a sort of a board, repository folder there that everybody has access to, organized nicely. So if you want to go back and look at, the October 2nd training, the presentation, and the recording, you can. So, and the only other thing I would ask you, maybe, Margaret, I made a note midway through.
I turned it around.
Yeah, before you send out your PowerPoint for us, if you wouldn't mind, I don't really care about the typos, but I do think if you, on those slides that have the sort of hypotheticals for us, if you wouldn't slap something on each one of them that says draft for discussion, or something that, so when we come back to, a month or two from now, we're not thinking, oh, that's, there's any, those examples and those few slides were just to illustrate how the programs work and the different choices work, and and definitely do not have real numbers in them yet.
Yeah.
Something, I don't know, just something to make sure that nobody gets, if
Yeah, because I mean, that's, you always get nervous presenting numbers, because then it's like,
Right. Right.
people will start
Yeah.
making
or if I show it to somebody
Decisions
in
on
the
that.
planning board, or Penny or Ed show it to somebody in EJN, nobody gets, starts hyperventilating over those numbers, because those are not definite.
will do.
Okay, well, I think we're at the end, and huge thank you. That was wonderful. You've obviously started with a lot of newbies already once before, many times in your prior career. So it's been very, very helpful. And maybe if everybody could get their questions to me, can I ask you to maybe do those over the weekend while it's fresh in your mind, and I'll package them up and I'll send you a consolidated list of everybody's questions and send them off to Margaret to get answers to later next week or whenever.
And I'll get the PowerPoint out in the next 20 minutes for Rich, so
Super.
that,
Good. That would be helpful.
Okay, thank you for the investment in time, everybody, and to be continued.
Very
I find
good.
it very exciting myself, probably especially if we could really double our subsidy income stream for our federal properties.
the game changer.
It could make a huge difference above and beyond anything else here. So thank you. Have a nice day, everybody. Nice weekend.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Margaret. Thank you so
Fantastic
much.
presentation.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
to see all of you.
Bye.
Take care.